The word sliced through me like a knife twisted slowly in an old wound, delivered with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years to say them. My daughter-in-law, Sophia, just inherited our family's entire chain of 12 lakeside vacation cabins in the North Georgia mountains. Her voice rang out in the attorney's office like she'd won the jackpot on a reality show, echoing off the wood-paneled walls and landing heavy in my chest. Her perfectly manicured fingers, nails painted that trendy mauve shade, waved the thick stack of property deeds like victory flags catching sunlight from the tall windows. "Lydia, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. You only get that run-down old orchard down in South Georgia." The words dripped with honey that tasted like poison. The clapping started right away, sharp and hollow like rain on a tin roof. Cousins I hadn't seen in a decade. Second cousins who only showed up when there was money on the table. Their perfume mixing with the stale coffee smell of the conference room. My late husband's brother Ray, who'd been borrowing from Robert for 25 years and never paid back a dime, clapped loudest of all, his gold watch flashing under the fluorescent lights. I sat there in the stiff leather chair that creaked under even my slight weight, my 68-year-old hands folded in my lap so tight my knuckles went white, watching my former daughter-in-law Sophia soak up the praise she'd clearly rehearsed for in the mirror 100 times. At 36, Sophia still looked like the beauty queen she'd been in college. Hair highlighted every 6 weeks at that fancy salon in Buckhead, designer jeans that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, the kind of confident smile that never had to ask permission for anything. She glowed with it, that victory glow, while something inside me quietly cracked. 12 cabins, she kept saying, holding up her phone to film everyone's congratulations for her Instagram stories, the camera flash bouncing off the mahogany table. Fully booked every summer, fall foliage season, winter ski weekends. Can you imagine the revenue? More applause, more hugs, more strangers telling her how blessed she was, how Robert would be so proud, their voices overlapping like a bad choir. The attorney, Mr. Caldwell, tried to move things along, clearing his throat the way men do when they're uncomfortable with female emotion, but Sophia wasn't done performing. Not yet. I looked across the table at my son Nathan, 42 years old, sitting there like a man watching his own funeral. His shoulders hunched under the expensive sport coat I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago, the one he'd never worn until today. He wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at the polished wood like it might open up and swallow him whole. The air smelled like lemon polish and tension thick enough to choke on. "Nathan," I said quietly, my voice barely above the rustle of papers, "you're awfully quiet today." He flinched like I'd shouted, his fingers tightening around the pen he wasn't using. Sophia answered for him, of course, sliding her chair closer to his with that proprietary little gesture she'd perfected years ago. "Nathan's just overwhelmed, Lydia. 12 properties is a huge responsibility. We're already talking to management companies, maybe hiring a full-time staff." Uncle Ray laughed too loud, his belly shaking under his golf shirt. "Sophia, you'll have to invite us all up for the grand celebration tour. 12 cabins, 12 parties." She turned to me with that fake sweet smile she'd perfected years ago, the one that never reached her eyes. "Lydia, you're welcome anytime, of course. I know the orchard isn't much, but maybe you could plant some peach trees or something. You were always so good with your hands." Good with my hands? That's what she called it when I fixed things instead of replacing them? When I grew my own vegetables instead of buying organic at Whole Foods? When I lived within my means instead of pretending I had more than I did? The words landed like a slap wrapped in velvet, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, that old familiar burn of being dismissed by someone who thought money made her better. I reached into my simple canvas tote, the one I'd carried since Nathan was in high school, its fabric worn soft from years of use, and pulled out my inheritance papers. The deed to 95 acres of old orchard land in Crisp County, Georgia. The place where Robert and I spent our 20th anniversary, picking muscadines under a sky so blue it hurt, laughing about how we'd retire there someday, far from the city and the noise and the expectations. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every memory we'd made on that land. An orchard, one of the cousins said, with that pity voice people use when they're secretly glad it wasn't them, the kind that makes you want to disappear into the carpet. Well, Lydia, at least you'll have fresh fruit. More laughter, thin and brittle, more sympathetic head tilts that felt like daggers. I stood up slowly, my knees reminding me I wasn't 30 anymore, the joints popping loud in the sudden quiet. The room went still, like they were waiting for me to cry or protest or do something dramatic, something they could post about later with sad emojis. Mr. Caldwell, is there anything else I need to sign? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. No, Mrs. Harrison, everything is in order. The orchard, the 95 acres, and all subsurface rights transfer to you immediately. Subsurface rights. The phrase floated past Sophia like it was written in a foreign language. She was too busy planning mountain cabin Instagram aesthetics to notice details, her thumbs already flying over her phone screen. I tucked my papers away and looked around at all those flushed, excited faces, the air thick with their second-hand triumph. Congratulations, everyone. I hope the cabins bring you everything you're expecting. The words tasted like ash, but I meant them in ways they couldn't possibly understand. I walked to the door, my sensible flats silent on the carpet, then paused with my hand on the cool brass handle. Nathan was finally looking at me, guilt written all over his handsome face, the face that still looked so much like his father's when he was unsure. Mom? He started, his voice cracking just enough to break my heart all over again.
You really don't know, do you? I asked softly, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. Sophia's head snapped up, her smile freezing. No what? I smiled, not the polite smile I'd worn for years at family functions, but the real one that came from knowing something they were about to learn the hard way. Nothing, honey. Nothing at all. I walked out of that office into the humid Atlanta afternoon, the heat wrapping around me like a wet blanket, leaving them to their celebration. The automatic doors whooshed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Sophia's voice rising in confusion. Let them plan their mountain getaways and rental empires and luxury renovations. Robert had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone, and in exactly 37 minutes, when I was back in my little condo in Decatur, I would open the letter he'd left with Mr. Caldwell, the one that would explain why my ex-husband gave his family exactly what they thought they deserved, while giving me what I'd actually earned. Some gifts are wrapped in plain paper for a reason. If you've ever been counted out, ever had people celebrate your loss while they thought they won, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel because I have more stories like this one, stories about women who looked broken but were actually becoming unbreakable. The drive home was a blur of traffic and memory, the AC in my Subaru blowing cool air that smelled faintly of the pine tree freshener I'd hung from the mirror years ago. My hands gripped the wheel of my 12-year-old Subaru, the one Sophia used to call my grandma car, with that little laugh that always made me feel small. Robert had died 6 weeks ago, peacefully, the doctor said. Heart failure, but quick at the end. We'd been divorced for 8 years, but we'd stayed close. Closer, in some ways, than when we were married. The grief still came in waves, catching me off guard at stoplights, making my eyes burn with tears I refused to let fall. I pulled into my complex, Oak Ridge condominiums, 2 bedrooms, ground floor, the one I'd bought after the divorce with my own savings. Not because I couldn't have asked Robert for more. I never wanted to need him that way again. The parking lot smelled like fresh-cut grass and barbecue from someone's grill. Mrs. Chen from next door was walking her little dog and waved, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light. How'd it go, Lydia? Her voice carried that gentle concern that made me want to cry for reasons I couldn't explain. About like I expected, I said, managing a smile that felt like lifting weights. She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. Inside, I dropped my tote on the kitchen counter, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet grounding me. The apartment smelled like the lavender candle I burned when I needed calm. I stared at the sealed envelope on the table where I'd left it this morning, Robert's handwriting still strong despite the illness. Lydia, in his careful block letters that I'd watched him practice when we were first married, determined to make his signature look important.
I made tea, chamomile with honey, the way I'd done every evening since the divorce, the steam rising warm and comforting as I sat in my reading chair by the window that looked out on the community garden I'd started 3 years ago. The envelope opened with a soft rip that sounded too loud in the quiet. The paper smelled faintly of Robert's cologne, the one he'd worn for 40 years, and I had to stop for a moment, pressing my hand to my chest as the ache bloomed fresh. My dearest Lydia, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you just sat through the show I knew Sophia would put on. I'm sorry you had to endure that, but it was necessary. What I'm about to tell you isn't revenge, it's education, the kind our son never got because I spent 40 years protecting him from failure instead of preparing him for it. You remember the orchard, don't you? We bought it 22 years ago after you found those soil samples that showed something unusual beneath the surface. You thought I was being romantic, buying land in your home county. I was, but I was also listening to the woman who taught me that real value is rarely obvious. The way you looked that day, standing in the dirt with your hair tied back and dirt under your nails, explaining geological layers like they were poetry. That was the moment I knew I'd married the smartest person I'd ever meet. The North Georgia cabins are beautiful. They're also drowning in debt I carefully structured over the last 5 years. Maintenance, taxes, insurance, HOA fees on 12 mountain properties. The numbers will hit Nathan like a freight train in about 90 days. But your orchard, Lydia? That land sits on one of the largest untapped lithium deposits in the southeast. I've spent the last 4 years quietly negotiating with 3 electric vehicle battery manufacturers. The contracts are signed. The first royalty checks begin 90 days after my death. Minimum 8 figures annually, escalating for 30 years. I needed Nathan to learn the difference between assets and liabilities, between a wife who loves him and one who loves his lifestyle, between flash and substance. I needed him to fall so you could catch him, because you're the only person I trust to help him rebuild on solid ground instead of sand. There's a key enclosed for a safety deposit box at First Georgia Bank in Cordell, Box 318. Everything you need there. Use it wisely. Use some for yourself. You spent decades taking care of everyone else. It's time someone took care of you. I love you. I never stopped. The divorce was my failure, not yours. You deserved better than a man who couldn't see past his own success to notice his wife was dying inside the life he built. Thank you for teaching me, even when I was too proud to learn. Robert. I read it twice, then a third time, tears falling onto the paper and blurring the ink. The key was there, heavy and real in my palm. Lithium. Of all things, the element powering the future, buried under peach trees and scuppernong vines in South Georgia, right where I'd pointed it all those years ago. Robert had listened. He'd always listened, even when I thought he wasn't. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. Nathan. I almost didn't answer, but the mother in me never could ignore her child. Mom, are you okay? That was intense today. I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you holding up? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Sophia's already planning. She found this designer in Asheville who specializes in luxury cabin renovations. We're driving up tomorrow to see the properties, start picking paint colors, maybe book a photographer for the relaunch. His excitement sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I closed my eyes, picturing him standing in their oversized kitchen, probably watching Sophia scroll through Pinterest while he worried about things she hadn't noticed yet. Paint colors, while the tax bills were already in the mail. That sounds ambitious, I said carefully, my heart aching for what I knew was coming.
I know it was hard seeing everyone react like that to your inheritance. Sophia didn't mean to be insensitive about the orchard. She just gets excited. The excuse came too quick, too practiced. She meant every word, Nathan, but you're not ready to hear that yet. The words slipped out before I could stop them, heavy with 8 years of watching him choose her over everything else. Silence stretched between us, filled with the hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen and the distant sound of children playing outside. "Mom," he finally said, his voice small, "I have to go. Sophia needs help picking fabrics." We talked for a few more minutes, surface things, safe things. He promised to call soon. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet and thought about the difference between teaching and rescuing, between love that cushions every fall and love that lets you hit the ground so you learn how to land. The chamomile had gone cold in my cup, but I drank it anyway, the bitterness fitting somehow. Tomorrow I'd drive to Cordell and see what Robert had really left me. Tonight, I sat in the darkening room and let myself grieve for the boy Nathan had been, the one who used to run to me when he fell off his bike, trusting I'd make it better. The man he'd become needed something different now, something harder. The first small revenge came 3 weeks later. I was at the orchard, walking the rows of old peach trees that hadn't been properly tended in years, their leaves rustling in the hot South Georgia breeze that smelled like sun-baked earth and distant rain. The realtor Robert had worked with, Sarah Ann Coleman, met me there with updated surveys and extraction productions, her sensible boots crunching on the gravel as she sprang papers across the hood of my car. We were standing under a massive pecan tree, its shade a relief from the relentless sun, when my phone rang. "Nathan." "Mom, I need to ask you something weird." "Anything, honey?" The words came automatically, even as my heart started pounding. "Did Dad ever mention anything about the cabins having issues, like financially?" His voice was careful, like he was stepping around broken glass. "What kind of issues?" I kept my tone neutral, watching a grasshopper leap from one blade of grass to another. Silence. Then, I got the first quarter tax bills yesterday, for all 12 properties. Mom, it's over $180,000 just for this quarter, and there are back maintenance fees on 7 of them because Dad deferred payments to keep cash flow looking better. The words tumbled out faster and faster, like he'd been holding them in for days. I looked out over the orchard, at the land that was about to make me wealthy beyond anything those cabins ever could. The peach trees stretched in perfect rows, their fruit just starting to swell, and beneath them, the future. My future. Nathan's future, if he could survive what was coming. "Have you talked to Sophia about this?" "She says not to worry, that rich people have accountants who handle these things, that Dad probably had trusts or something we haven't found yet." His laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. I almost laughed too. Sophia, who thought money grew on designer handbags, who'd once returned a $400 purse because it didn't match her shoes. "Nathan, before you make any big decisions, get an independent accountant to look at everything. Promise me." My voice came out stronger than I expected, the words carrying 22 years of knowing this land held secrets. "Mom, why do you sound like you know something's wrong?" The question hung between us, heavy with everything unsaid. "Because your father was very deliberate about what he left you. And sometimes, what looks like a gift is actually a test." I paused, listening to his breathing on the other end of the line, fast and shallow. "Nathan, I love you. Just, be careful." That was my small turn. The first moment I pushed back instead of staying silent. The first time I let him hear the warning in my voice instead of protecting him from it. The first time, I chose Robert's plan over my mother's heart. 2 months after the reading, the avalanche began. I was in Cordell, meeting with the executives from the battery companies in a conference room that smelled like new carpet and ambition. The contracts were staggering. $2.1 million quarterly royalties to start, with built-in increases as production scaled. The first payment had already hit my new account, more money than I'd ever imagined seeing at one time. I'd paid cash for a modest house on the edge of the orchard, nothing fancy, but mine. 3 bedrooms, wraparound porch, the smell of fresh paint still lingering when I opened the windows. Nathan called at 11:07 p.m., the kind of call that makes a mother's heart stop before the phone even rings. "Mom, I need help." His voice was shredded, like he'd been screaming into pillows for days. "The banks are calling in the loans on 8 of the cabins. Dad used them as collateral for business lines of credit I didn't even know existed. The interest rates adjusted upward last month. We can't make the payments." The words poured out in a rush, each one heavier than the last. I listened as he poured it out, sitting on my new porch with the phone pressed to my ear and crickets singing in the background. The HOA fees on the mountaintop properties that cost more per year than most people's mortgages. The insurance that had lapsed on 3 cabins because premiums weren't paid. The management company that quit because they hadn't been paid in 6 months. The way Sophia's solution was to refinance everything, take out new loans to pay the old ones, host destination weddings at the properties to generate revenue, start an Airbnb luxury collection with professional photos and custom welcome baskets. "Nathan, how long can you keep this up?" My voice sounded calm, but my hands were shaking. 3 months. Maybe 4 if we drain every account. Mom, we're going to lose them. All of them. The defeat in his voice was worse than anger would have been. "Have you thought about selling some?" "Sophia won't hear it. She's already told everyone, posted the deeds online, captioned it, 'Living my legacy.' Selling would be admitting defeat." His laugh was hollow, the sound of a man watching his life burn. "She's planning a launch party for next month, invited 200 people, hired a string quartet." "And how do you feel about that?" "I feel like I'm watching my marriage die in slow motion while my wife plans our funeral on Instagram." The words hung between us, raw and terrible and true. That was the moment I knew Robert's plan was working, the moment the pretty wrapping paper started tearing, revealing the sharp edges underneath. The moment I had to choose between catching my son too soon or letting him fall far enough to learn how to fly. Sophia showed up at my new house 4 months after the will reading. I'd been expecting her. The red BMW convertible in my driveway looked ridiculous against the pecan trees and dirt road, its shiny paint already collecting dust. She marched up my porch steps in heels that sunk into the soft ground with every step, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair like a crown. "Lydia, we need to talk." Her voice carried that edge it got when things weren't going according to plan. "By all means, come in." I held the door open, the smell of fresh-baked peach cobbler drifting from the kitchen where I'd been testing recipes for the farm store I was planning. She looked around my simple farmhouse kitchen like she was afraid the poverty might be contagious. Wood floors I'd refinished myself, the scent of lemon oil still in the air. Countertops I'd installed with help from YouTube videos, their granite cool under my fingers. Fresh peaches in a bowl on the table from trees that were about to make me richer than her wildest dreams. "Nathan's talking about selling 9 of the cabins," she announced without preamble, dropping her designer purse on my table like she owned the place. 9. Do you understand what that means?
It means he's trying to survive. I kept my voice level, pouring 2 glasses of sweet tea, because that's what you do in South Georgia, even when someone's come to fight. It means he's destroying Robert's legacy because he can't see the vision. Her words came fast, sharp, practiced. "Sophia, what exactly is the vision?
I handed her the tea, watching her take it automatically, even as her eyes narrowed. Luxury mountain retreats, a brand, a lifestyle, the Harrison name on coffee table books about Southern hospitality. We're so close. Her hands gestured wide, like she could see it all playing out in front of her. Close to bankruptcy, from what I hear. Her eyes narrowed, the glass of tea forgotten in her hand. How do you know about our finances? Because my son calls me when he's drowning and his wife is telling him to swim faster toward the waterfall? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was tired of pretending. She started pacing, heels clicking on my wood floors, the sound echoing in the quiet house. Those cabins are everything Robert worked for. They're symbols. Symbols don't pay tax bills, Sophia. The words hung between us, simple and brutal. She stopped, stared at me, her face going pale beneath the perfect makeup. There's something you're not telling us. Nathan said you warned him months ago, like you knew this would happen. I knew your father-in-law better than anyone alive. I knew he didn't leave things to chance. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. This was the moment, the one Robert had planned for. What does that mean? I walked to my office and came back with the folder I'd prepared, the one that weighed more than all the cabin deeds combined. Geological surveys, extraction contracts, financial projections that made the North Georgia cabins look like the money pit they were. This is what Robert left me, I said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table like a winning hand. Lithium rights under 95 acres of orchard, enough to supply 3 major battery manufacturers for decades, 8 figures annually starting last quarter. Sophia went white beneath her spray tan, the glass of tea trembling in her hand. That's not possible. $2.1 million last quarter, another due in 6 weeks, debt-free, sustainable, renewable resource. I watched her face as the numbers sunk in, watched the perfect world she'd built crumble in real time. She stared at the contracts like they were written in fire. He knew! He knew exactly what he was doing. Why didn't you tell us? Her voice cracked, the first real emotion I'd heard from her in years. Because Nathan needed to learn what happens when you build your life on borrowed money and borrowed time. When you marry someone who loves your lifestyle more than your life. I love Nathan. The words came automatically, but they sounded hollow even to her. Do you? Or do you love what you thought his inheritance would buy you? She sat down hard in my kitchen chair, the fight going out of her like air from a punctured balloon. The woman who'd celebrated my apparent poverty with champagne toasts and Instagram stories looked suddenly small in my simple farmhouse kitchen. What happens now? Now you decide if you're going to help my son save what's left of his father's real legacy, or if you're going to keep pretending 12 sinking ships can be saved by rearranging the deck chairs. She left 20 minutes later, crying in her BMW, the engine revving too hard as she pulled away. I watched her drive away and felt no triumph, only sadness for the lessons that were still coming, for the boy who'd once fallen off his bike and run to me crying, trusting I'd make it better, for the man who needed something different now, something harder. Nathan showed up 3 weeks later with everything he owned in the back of a rented truck. The divorce papers were filed. Sophia had taken half of what was left after the forced sales, about $180,000, and moved to Charlotte to start over with someone who still had mountain cabins. The truck looked too small for a life that had once filled a 6-bedroom house with designer furniture and professional photos on the walls. He stood on my porch looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him in person, his eyes red-rimmed and his shoulders curved inward, like he was carrying invisible weight. Mom, I'm sorry. For everything. For not listening. For letting her treat you like that. For being too weak to see what was happening. His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw the boy he'd been for just a moment. Come inside, baby.
My arms opened before I thought about it, and he walked into them like he was 8 years old again, his head resting on my shoulder as he cried the kind of tears that come from losing everything you thought defined you. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd shown Sophia the truth, and I told him everything. The lithium, the contracts, Robert's letters, the safety deposit box that held his half of the orchard operation, waiting for when he was ready. I watched his face change as he read his father's words, saw the grief and understanding and something like peace settle over him. Dad knew I'd fail. He knew you'd learn. Is it too late? It's never too late when you're willing to start over on solid ground. We opened the champagne Robert had left in the safety deposit box that night, the one he'd been saving for 20 years, the cork popping loud in the quiet kitchen. To second chances, I toasted, my voice thick with tears I finally let fall. To becoming the man Dad believed I could be, Nathan answered, his hand shaking as he raised his glass. 18 months later, I stood in the new processing facility we'd built on the orchard property. Clean, efficient, designed for minimal environmental impact and maximum community benefit. The air smelled like fresh-cut lumber and possibility. Nathan reviewed the latest royalty reports with the focus of someone who now understood every decimal point, his fingers tracing the numbers like they were sacred. The new contract with the Korean battery company just came through, another $1.4 million quarterly starting next year.
I nodded, watching young people from Crisp County, many of them first-generation college students we'd put through technical training, operating equipment that would power the future. Their laughter carried through the open doors, mixing with the hum of machinery and the scent of peach blossoms drifting in on the breeze. We'd turned part of the orchard into the Harrison Sustainable Resource Institute, training programs in green energy, water conservation, agricultural technology, scholarships funded by royalties, apprenticeships that paid living wages while teaching skills that couldn't be outsourced. The farm store had become a gathering place, its shelves stocked with jams and jellies made from our own fruit, the cash register ringing steady with locals and tourists alike. "Dad would love this," Nathan said quietly, looking out at the rows of peach trees heavy with fruit. "He does, wherever he is." We'd kept 15 acres of peach trees, expanded the muscadine vines until they covered the hillside like a purple blanket, built a farm store that employed 20 local people and supplied Atlanta restaurants with organic produce. The lithium extraction happened on the back 40, invisible from the road, carefully monitored to protect the aquifer and the land that had given us everything. Nathan had met someone, Maria, one of our first scholarship recipients, now running the agricultural education program. They were taking it slow, building on ground that wouldn't shift beneath them. I'd caught them laughing together in the orchard last week, her hand brushing his as they picked peaches, and felt something warm settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the Georgia sun. A letter came last month from Sophia. Return address: a women's correctional facility in North Carolina. Investment fraud. She'd convinced several widows to invest in a luxury cabin renovation fund that existed only on paper. Her handwriting was smaller now, more careful, lacking the confident loops that had once signed credit card receipts for $1,000 shoes. Nathan read the letter and put it in the file with all the others, his face carefully neutral. "I'll consider her application like anyone else's," he said. "If she's ready to work and learn and contribute, there'll be a place. If she's still looking for shortcuts, there won't be." That was growth, real growth, the kind that comes from falling hard and choosing to get back up anyway. Some evenings I walk the orchard rows at sunset. The peach trees are heavy with fruit again, their branches bending under the weight of sweetness. The lithium flows quietly beneath, powering electric cars and phones and dreams of a cleaner future. The air smells like warm earth and possibility, and I think about Robert, about the elaborate,
painful, perfect plan he made to save our son by letting him fall. About how the plainest wrapping sometimes holds the greatest gifts. About how the orchard everyone pitied me for inheriting became the foundation we built everything else on. Pride doesn't come from 12 mountain cabins you can't afford to heat. It comes from standing in land your husband gave you because he trusted you to catch your son when he fell, and discovering you were both strong enough to build something that would last long after the flash and noise faded away. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever been the one left with what everyone thought was nothing, only to discover it was everything, tell me in the comments. You're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories of women who rose from what looked like ashes, subscribe and stay with me. We're just getting started.